Okay, we are starting our lecture on learning, and this is one of my favorite chapters, as you shall soon see why. I think that learning is fascinating, and what we're learning this week is amazing because it's talking about how do we come to know what we know, and how do we come to do what we do? How do we learn these things? And this topic, what you're learning this week, I believe are things that you may think about for the rest of your life. And it may change the way you think about how you've lived your life and what you've learned in your life. So here's a picture of me as a 7-year-old, and I show it to you because I am often, having learned some of the material that we're talking about this week, I often go back and think about things in my past that led me to learn what I've learned. And I'm kind of predicting that the same thing is going to happen to you, but you can let me know one way or the other. So, as we talk about learning, we're going to talk about 4 different types of learning. One is classical conditioning, which is all about unconsciously associating one thing to another thing. Another is operant conditioning, which is about repeating what leads to something good or what led to something good and avoiding what led to something bad. It's all about learning from consequences. Then there's latent learning. I like to think of this as learning by exploring. As you move about your life, you see something, you remember something, you store it away. And then there is observational learning, which is learning by watching other people. And as you see, Pavlov is classical conditioning, Skinner is operant conditioning, Tolman is latent learning, and Bandura is observational learning. And now let's talk about them more in depth. Classical conditioning. This is about involuntary responses that are associated to stimuli. Now let's get into this. And the way we're going to get into this is you're going to watch a video. So stop this video and go and click on the video about the Pavlov's dogs and watch it. It'll take you about 3 minutes. Do it now. Okay, I think you've done that, and welcome back. And let's talk about some of these components of classical conditioning. And to get this, I wanted you to have more than just one example. So we have the example of Pavlov's dogs, and now we also have the example of Dwight and Jim. You're also welcome to stop now and watch Dwight and Jim. Okay, I love that video. And this is going to give us hopefully a good sense of the different components of classical conditioning. So the whole idea in classical conditioning is that it starts out and there's some sort of natural process. So there's a neutral stimulus. Before conditioning, the neutral stimulus, in the case of Jim and Dwight, is the sound of a computer starting. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. For the dogs, it's the bell. The bell doesn't have anything to do with eating. It doesn't have anything to do with salivating. The other part of classical conditioning that happens before conditioning is the unconditioned stimulus. So this means that there's some stimulus that allows for, that triggers some natural response. So the unconditioned stimulus for Pavlov was the food that he gave his dogs, which made them salivate. That's the unconditioned response. And the unconditioned stimulus for Jim was giving Dwight the mint, which, sort of soothed Dwight's dry mouth, right? And the dry mouth is the unconditioned response. Well, what happens after conditioning is that now you have a conditioned stimulus, which is related to a conditioned response. So for the dogs, the bell triggers the salivation, even though the bell has nothing to do with eating. And the sound of the computer triggers the dry mouth in Dwight, even though the sound of the computer has nothing to do with having a dry mouth. It's just that this association between one thing and another thing created this sense of expectation. The body has now learned to salivate when the bell rings or have a dry mouth when the computer starts up. Another thing is sometimes in school you may hear the sound of a bell and you get up and you get up and get your books, you know. Like that's another kind of unconditioned response because you're so used to this thing being paired to that stimulus, you have this sort of natural response in your body. All happens unconsciously. There's also this idea of the conditioned emotional response. Sometimes what can be paired with a stimuli is an emotional response. And in this case of little Albert, the conditioned emotional response was fear. Fortunately, I don't have a video of this because I think it would be upsetting. What happened in the little Albert experiment is they had this they actually went to an orphanage and found this particularly placid baby. The baby never cried. The baby was really easygoing. And this is really cruel, and there's so many experiments in psychology that are so cruel. But anyway, we can't help that. So they take little Albert, and they wanted to see if they could make little Albert afraid of bunnies. So first they brought the bunny, and they let little Albert play with the bunny, and he was happy playing. The bunny didn't bother little Albert at all. Next, they take the bunny, and as they're presenting it to little Albert, they make a loud noise in the background that scares little Albert. Like it was really loud. They do this a couple of times, and now, whenever they show little Albert the bunny, he cries. He's scared of the bunny. And in fact, that little boy grew up to be scared of fuzzy things. He generalized his fear to not only being about bunnies, but also being about stuffed animals, all sorts of fuzzy things. They scared him because of what happened when he was a little baby. The association of this really scary stimuli and this innocuous little fuzzy thing has become a lifelong association. And that's one of the prime examples of a conditioned emotional response. One of the professors, another professor at Chaffey, we had a nice conversation last night, and we were talking about some of the things that get us through COVID-19. And he said, oh, chocolate, because I always eat a chocolate at the time when I'm done my work and I can relax. And so now the chocolate makes me relax. He sort of has a relaxation response, which is almost an emotional response to his little bite of chocolate at like 7 at night. So that's kind of a good response. So there are many principles of classical conditioning, and you will read about these principles in your textbook, and they're sufficiently complex that I'm just going to leave it up to you to go through and understand different ways in which the conditioned response is acquired and what happens when you generalize it to other things that are similar to it. And discrimination is about how if little Albert was afraid of stuffed animals but not afraid of, say, crocodiles, because he's or maybe horses, because horses are big and not small and fuzzy. He's discriminating between animals. Extinction is when gradually the association wears off. Like if, say, my professor colleague starts eating chocolate right before he has to talk to angry students or something, like he may lose that conditioned response of relaxation and chocolate. And on it goes. There are different principles associated with classical conditioning. But now we're going to talk about operant conditioning. And this is where you're learning through the consequences of what you do. If you do something and you get something good, you're going to repeat it. If you do something and you get something bad, you're going to avoid it. You're not going to do that anymore. And this is how they say teach rats in a cage. If they press this lever, they're going to get some food. And then they learn to press the lever. Whereas the lever has no meaning to them otherwise. There's no meaning in a rat's life about a lever. But if the rat accidentally hits the lever and food comes out, the rat starts to go, well, hey, this is pretty good, and starts to hit the lever, and you can teach pigeons to do this. You can teach dogs to do this by sitting. Operant conditioning is a massive force of how we learn in our lives. Essentially, so here we have it. Here's like a visual of how this happens. First, you have a behavior. Oops, I press the lever. Then you have a consequence, which is either, sometimes it's called a reward, sometimes it's called a reinforcement, or a punishment. Now, if they call it a reinforcement, it's in my opinion that they should call the punishment a de-enforcement, because punishment is kind of confusing. It's not like you did anything wrong. It's just that a bad consequence resulted. So like if you are running outside without your shoes on and you stub your toe in the concrete, it's not like you did anything wrong, but essentially that's the same thing as a punishment. You're going to learn to not be running around outside without your shoes on because it hurt. I would like to call it a de-enforcement. So, the definition is a reinforcement increases behavior, and a punishment or de-enforcement decreases behavior. And like to sort of illustrate this, there was this childhood game that I had. It was called Operation, and you plugged it in, and there was just you had these tweezers, and you had to pull out like the funny bone or the butterflies in the stomach. And to pull it out, you had to like use the tweezers to get the little thing, but if you hit the metal edge, there would be this buzzer sound, and the nose would light up. And I found this game was punishing. Like it was supposed to be fun to be able to pull the thing out of the little socket there without making the buzzer buzz. But I found that the noise and the nose lighting up was so punishing. I never wanted to play this game. So this is an example of how when we talk about what is reinforcing or what is punishing, it's kind of unique to every individual. And so it's not like there's a recipe book of rewards and a recipe book of punishments. Although some things you can kind of guess, like for example, well, I'll show you in a second, some things are kind of naturally reinforcing and some kinds are secondarily reinforcing. But let's just put a name to this principle. Thorndike's law of effect. So Thorndike's observed that any behavior followed by a pleasant consequence is likely to be repeated, and any behavior followed by an unpleasant consequence is likely to be stopped. Thorndike put this cat in a box, and I like this cat in a box. One of the things that he used this experiment for is to show that learning happens. I mean, you may not think like, why do I need to bother with demonstrating that learning happens or not? But when you have a cat, you can't ask them, did you learn the way out of the box? Did you figure that out? The cat's just going to do what the cat's going to do, especially cats. The dog might try to answer you, but not cats. They're too cool for that. So we'd put this cat in the box, and there was a little lever that would open the door and let the cat out. Now, the cat did not like being in the box. It was inherently unpleasant and distressing for a cat to be in a cage. And typically, the lever was placed in such a way that it wasn't necessarily obvious. It wasn't that the cat would find it right away. But so the first time the cat was placed in the box, on average, it took about, 6 minutes for the cat to accidentally step on the lever and open the box. And what happened is, very shortly after just 3 times, the cat figured out that it could step on that lever and open the box. And each time the cat was put in the box successively, it took less and less and less time. So much so that it took almost no seconds for the cat to go, "Oh, I know what to do. I'm going to press on that lever and it's going to open the door and I'm going to get the heck out of here." So, this is how Thorndike did some of his studies. And I just am giving you another picture of a cat in a box, because what's funnier than especially a big fat cat like this in a box? So, another name to associate with operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner. Um, he was a big deal. He's very influential in the mid 1900s, right? In the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s. And he's considered to be the father of operant conditioning, because he really did all of these experiments with animals, with pigeons, with rats, and he had a very specific belief about psychology, which was, he believed that if, like, he's sort of reacting to Freud, because if you remember, Freud was he was just sort of talking about what was going on inside people's heads, as if he knew. And Skinner was saying, we're not scientific if we're studying something that we can't observe. So we should only be studying behavior. We should only study what is external, what is observable. And one great thing about operant conditioning is that it's observable. There's a stimulus and there's a response. So Skinner was a really big proponent of this. So what is the evidence of influencing behavior is its increase and its decrease. But one of the things that I just want you to take a minute to think about is, do you think that psychology should limit itself to the study of only that which can be directly observed? And now recall some of our discussion about research methods, right? Because some of the problems with our research methods in psychology are self-report measures. If we ask you, how do you feel about this? How strongly do you agree? That's all coming, we can't directly observe. We have to trust you that you're telling us the truth. And we have to trust you that you can even discriminate what your feelings are. If we ask you what you ate in the morning, we have to trust you that you can remember and not forget about the chocolate that you ate on the way out the door, So this particular question that Skinner was so adamant that we only study what can be observed, it comes out of an inherent problem in psychology, which is, if we're going to study mental processes, we kind of need to ask people, because we can't directly observe them. So anyway, this is just a little digression, a big issue in psychology, and I'd like you to maybe spend a little time thinking about it. So there are different ways to increase behavior and different ways to decrease behavior. And this terminology gets really confusing, because it's talking about positive and negative, not in terms of good or bad. I know, how confusing. But positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement are two good things, if you can believe it. Positive reinforcement means there's something there, like it's the presence of something. So it's like giving you something good. And negative reinforcement means, oh, it's taking away something bad. So if my neighbor's playing loud music and it's driving me crazy because it's like Sting or something, can't stand Sting. Oh. My husband loves him. Anyway, so, and neighbors playing, and if I call and politely ask, would you mind turning that down in a little while, using my best friendly skills? And then in a short while, the music turns down. I am negatively reinforced for being polite, right? Um, because something good is something, well, it gets so confusing. It's removing something bad. Or let's say your mother remember that example of she's nagging you to get out of bed when you were in high school? Get out of bed. It's time for school. Maybe it was your father. Get out of bed. And the only thing that's going to I don't want to say it, but shut her up is if you get out of bed. So there's something reinforcing about your getting out of bed because you're now stopping the bad noise that you don't want to hear anymore. And the same thing goes in the two ways to decrease behavior, which is to give a punishment like, I'm going to spank you, or that would be a positive punishment, like the presence of something. Although I don't support spanking, it's just the only idea, the thought that crossed my mind. Or the negative punishment. I'm not going to let you play on your Xbox if you do that. So see how there's like the presence or the absence of something in this positive or negative language? And then the other thing that we want to understand is that there are, let's just say, a primary reinforcer could be a cupcake. Like something sweet is a primary reinforcer. People like sweet things. But something that would be secondary is a learned reinforcer. For example, if you work hard and you get a good grade, that reward is the good grade. But that good grade, the idea about what is a good grade, you have to learn that that's a good thing. Whereas if you give me a cookie, I'm going to like it one way or the other. I don't have to learn that the cookie is a good thing. Or a hug, or a parent's kind regard, you know, um, all of those things are primary reinforcers, but then there are all sorts of secondary reinforcers that we have learned are nice to get, like a pair of tennis shoes. There's nothing inherently good about tennis shoes, unless you're running around on the concrete. Now, there's some warnings about punishments, especially when we're raising children. One thing to know about a punishment that is if you apply a punishment and the behavior doesn't decrease, it's not a punishment, right? So the kid's running around in the grocery store and the parent says, "Stop it, Johnny, stop it. Stop it, Johnny, stop it." And the kid doesn't stop. That's not a punishment. It's completely ineffective. The only way that you know something is a punishment or a de-enforcer is if behavior decreases. To be effective, a punishment must be direct, immediately following the behavior, and consistent, right? And if you rely too much on punishment instead of reinforcement, you could get into some problems. Because punishment could lead to undesirable emotional responses. If all a kid ever knows is that he's punished, he never gets the sense that what he's doing is good. All he gets is the sense that what he's doing is bad, and therefore will conclude that the child is bad, that I'm bad. I'm bad. That could lead to passive aggressiveness. It could lead to lying and avoidance. If your dominant way of interacting with a child is to punish bad behavior, they're going to lie about their bad behavior. It could lead to, it could be like a modeling of bad behavior, especially if it's spanking, because spanking is a form of violence, and you don't want to teach kids that hitting is the solution. It could lead to suppression of behavior instead of the elimination of behavior, learned helplessness, or an escalating vicious cycle. I want to talk to you about learned helplessness. So this is what happens when there's a punishment, a de-enforce, a punishing, behavior that you can't control. This was done by Seligman, who actually is the father of positive psychology. But early in his career, he put dogs on this shock pad, and uh, I'm not. I'm going to let you read about this because I feel like I need to get moving into the other types of learning. Now, another aspect of operant learning is shaping. And here's a picture of a nice lady with a dolphin, because this is often how animals are trained. You can't teach a dolphin to jump through a fiery hoop just like that. What you do is you teach the dolphin to go through toward the hoop. And as they get closer to the hoop, you reward that behavior. And as they jump through the hoop, you reward that behavior. And as they endure being around the fiery hoop, you reward that behavior. And as they jump, you're rewarding successive things. That's called shaping. You allow yourself to reward for a behavior that begins to approach what you're looking for, even if it's not quite exactly what you're looking for. It's a very important message, especially for training dogs. Another concept in operant conditioning is the schedule of reinforcement. That means the rate at which your reinforcement comes and the pattern of it is going to lead to different types, a different type of response. So one pattern could be continuous reinforcement or intermittent, but I want to bring your attention to this variable ratio schedule. That means that you don't know when you're going to get rewarded. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And this is the schedule of the slot machine. It causes people are crazy, to play. Well, no, maybe you like to play slot machines and I don't want to offend you. But in my worldview, it's throwing money, good money after bad. But it creates this desire, especially if the payoff is big, and you never know if it's going to be the next one. Now, when I do my Candy Crush playing on my phone, I'm kind of involved in the same kind of addictive behavior of sometimes I get the bright shiny explosions really easily, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes it takes me 10, 12, 20 tries before I can win a game. Sometimes more, I admit it. And sometimes I win instantly and I feel like $1,000,000. So that's my form of being susceptible to the variable ratio schedule of you never quite know when you're going to get that reward. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive social learning, and here I'm focusing in on Tolman and his observation about latent learning. And again with the mice and the rodents. He studied rats in a maze. And I don't know why, I just love this experiment, because one of the things that had been assumed is that animals they only learn when they're rewarded for something. And so what they would do is they would put cheese, I'm calling it cheese, something yummy at the end of a maze, and then the rat would smell the yummy thing and find their way through the maze, and they would thus learn the pattern of the maze. Great, that's fine. But Tolman was like, hey, what happens if, over here in this maze, we just let the rats sniff around? There's no food in it. And sure enough, the rats go exploring and they look through, and, they spend a certain amount of time. Meanwhile, over here in this maze, there are some they're probably mice, but I get them mixed up. There's a rat and it's been learning the maze because it's been hunting out its reward, right? Now, they put the they take the rats, one that had been trained in the maze with a reward and one that had just been exploring. And then they put the reward at the end. And guess what? The rats that had just been exploring, it barely took them any time at all to find the cheese. So, so this was evidence that the rat who was just exploring was learning how to get through the maze. And this is what is called a cognitive map. We begin to map out our world. We begin to understand things even before we need them to get our rewards. We're learning, you know, as we go. So there are some key factors. I want to talk about observational learning, and this is sort of Bandura's thing, this Bobo doll thing. But let me just talk to you about these 4 key factors in observational learning. First of all, are you paying attention? And now we're talking about whether you're learning from other people. Are you paying attention? Can you remember it? Can you do it again if you try? And do you have motivation to want to learn this thing? Okay. And so Bandura, we've met Bandura before because he's talked to us about self-efficacy. And I think we've also, have we met him yet? No, this is our first meeting of Bandura, but he's a very influential modern psychologist, still alive, kind of old now, but has made a lot of contributions, particularly in the area of self-efficacy. But his early career work was focused on the fact that children learn by watching. And here is another link to a video, fascinating video. Watch this video, where he demonstrated that a child can learn to do violent things by watching an adult do violent things. And in this, you can see how this little boy beats up on a poor child. It's like one of these bouncy toys. And what you'll see is that this little boy is directly imitating what the adult had done before. And weird things that a kid would never think to do in some ways. And so this is just like in some ways this is obvious that of course we learn by watching, but psychology needs to give evidence of things, and so Bandura is credited for giving evidence that things, including aggression, can be learned by watching aggression. So that is the lecture on learning. There are way more interesting things in your reading this week, so I think you're going to enjoy it. I couldn't possibly touch on it all, but thank you for watching.